Well, good afternoon, and welcome to what's become an annual event, which is Hopkins Retrospective sponsors one of these sessions each time at Alumni Weekend, although this time it should be called Alumni Weekend in honor of honor in the subject. And I wonder how many of you are alumni? Well, that's a pretty good showing. Wait a minute, I saw one guy's hand up there. This is the NAE.
They've explained it one.
Yeah, with the Latin. Well, I'm Bill Leslie. I'm a historian here. Among other things, I'm writing a history of Hopkins and also working on Hopkins Retrospective, and I'm going to do some introductions about that before we begin the panel. But thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Believe it or not, we have more full professors who are women on this panel than we did when the first class of women undergraduates came to Hopkins in 1970. There were at that time, well, there was one. That hadn't been the only one we ever had. We had people like Florence Sabin, but in 1970 there was one full professor, including the medical school and the School of Arts and Sciences. There were other professors, but we've come a long way because I assembled 4 and I've already got 2, and so I think that's pretty good.
High five.
Now, yeah, well, we can, I think, honestly claim that we're the first research university in America. We were also the last good research university to grant PhDs to women. Our record was not really very good. Chicago, Cornell, Columbia, Harvard, Yale were all ahead of us in terms of allowing women to enter our graduate programs and awarding them PhDs. So we were hardly a pioneer, and we were hardly a pioneer in admitting women undergraduates either, obviously. I wanted to give you just a couple of examples because there were women who wanted to do graduate study here, but they were always taken on a case-by-case basis by the Board of Trustees and the president himself. And they would decide whether somebody should be admitted or not. So M. Carey Thomas, who you know as the dean and president of Bryn Mawr College, applied to study Greek with Basil Gildersleeve, our professor of Greek. Now remember, she is the daughter of one of the trustees. Can you imagine if one of the trustees' daughters today said, I'd like to enter graduate school, and they had a meeting to decide whether that was true? They allowed her to attend, but not to finish her degree. So M. Carey Thomas went off and founded her own school and had a happy ending. But Christine Ladd, who was a mathematician and a gifted one at that, wanted to study with J.J. Sylvester. Again, the trustees took it up, and obviously she had the qualifications to do the program. Sylvester certainly thought that she had the talent. She completed all the requirements. She was allowed to complete all the requirements for her PhD in mathematics, and we did award her a degree 44 years later at the 50th anniversary of Johns Hopkins. So that's a second story. And the third one is geologist Florence Bascom, who was the daughter of the president of the University of Wisconsin, came here to study geology. And in that case, the trustees again met, and they made an exception. And they gave her a degree in 1893, and they gave the next one to a woman in 1911. So our record is pretty mixed. That's not, of course, the case with the School of Medicine. The School of Medicine, from the very beginning, admitted women on equal footing with men. Why? Because they were coerced into it by the Women's Fund, which had raised the money. Otherwise, the medical school would not have been able to open in 1893. And among the faculty, the founding faculty of medicine, there was a great debate over whether they should accept this gift and open the medical school with the condition that women be admitted on equal terms with men, or whether they should turn it down. What's interesting to me is that they decided, they were more worried about the strict admissions criteria that the women insisted upon than they were upon letting women into the school. So the women actually wanted a stricter standard for admission to the medical school than the faculty thought they should have. The faculty, I think, only half-jokingly said, if we had this kind of admission standards, none of us would get in. And a final story about one of our great Nobel Prize winners that was not on the faculty when she got the Nobel Prize because she was not allowed to be on the faculty because of anti-nepotism statutes. Maria Geppert-Meyer who was one of the great physicists of her generation, came here as a faculty spouse. Her spouse was in the chemistry department. We only allowed her to be an administrative assistant in the physics department. She managed to still write papers even as an assistant, but we didn't give her a professorship, which she clearly deserved. So she eventually went off to UCSD, where she did win the Nobel Prize, and now they have Nobel Drive, to which she adds luster, and our dean is in fact a graduate of UCSD, which has both the Nobel Drive and the Gilman Drive, which I think is a case of stolen valor, since he's really our guy, even if he founded the University of California. But not a bad exacta having Berkeley and Hopkins. Okay, enough about the past. Now to look at accomplished women from the history and from the present day, actually. We have a great panel. I have two quick introductions that I want to do to introduce you. Allison Saylor is our new program manager for Hopkins Retrospective. She was taking over the job that Jenny Kniff had done, and she's a graduate of UMBC in the public history program. She's worked at the B&O Railroad Museum and the archives. She's done teaching for undergraduates at Washington College and UMBC, and is doing just a tremendous job running Hopkins Retrospective, so make sure you get one of our little cards or something afterwards. But she does a lot of history of first-generation college students and about women at Hopkins, so if she collars you afterwards in the cocktail hour with her tape recorder, don't take offense. And the second was Sabrina. Where did Sabrina go? Oh, she's got a, yeah.
She's in the back.
There she is, okay. Sabrina is a sophomore history major who has helped me a lot on the study of Jean Eichelberger Ivy at the Peabody Conservatory. She's working now on the archival material on women at Hopkins. She proves that even our undergraduate history majors are terrific. Her father, Bill, over there was a student of mine back in 1984, and so she's a second-generation Hopkins student, and we're very delighted to have her. Her mom, by the way, won a prize at one of the events for Hopkins on Film, although she's not a Hopkins grad, but she knew more than a Hopkins grad, so we decided we'd give her the prize. Okay, let me introduce our panelists, and then we'll begin the discussion. Our first panelist is Mindy Farber. She graduated in the first co-ed class of 1974, elected to Phi Beta Kappa. She was the first Hopkins student to win the Root Tilden Fellowship, which is for the study of law at NYU. She got her law degree, became a civil rights attorney, a very successful one. And at Hopkins, she organized a number of things. I'll list just a few. The first Women's Center, the first Festival of Women, which was to celebrate the graduation of that first class. And she calls herself the troublesome student that brought to campus Jane Fonda, Hanoi Jane in those days, and Alger Hiss, the infamous Hopkins graduate. And she wrote me, I think, a really fun email, and she recalls when she sat down with Steve Muller, the president, and I'll quote from her note. She said, "Steve Muller brought me into his office at Garland Hall and showed me a knee-high stack of letters from alumni protesting my selection of speakers. He then grinned and said, 'Mindy, this is what we call alumni engagement.'" So she's served many roles here. She's been head of the Parents Association. She organized several reunion projects, including one for that first class. I'm sure they'll be doing something next year, which is even grander, and been on the Alumni Association, and been awarded the Hopkins Heritage Award in 2016. So our next speaker will be Grace Brush from what had been the Department of Geography and Environmental Engineering, and I can't get used to calling it anything else, really. But if we had something like Japan does, which has what they call living national treasures, I would put Grace on the Hopkins list. She arrived here in 1969, and she's been going strong ever since. She grew up in Nova Scotia, graduated at only 18 from college, went on to graduate school in paleobiology, first at the University of Illinois, and then at Harvard, where she eventually got her degree. And her recollection of Harvard, I just can't resist sharing a couple of sentences, but she says, "Even though I was a graduate student studying at all-male Harvard, I was not really aware of any sexual discrimination because women students, who were officially Radcliffe students, attended classes at Harvard with the men. However, exams were taken separately as the Radcliffe women were on the honor system and the Harvard men were not." Now, what that says about Harvard men, I'm not sure. She and her husband, Lucian Brush, who was an expert on rivers and transport of sediment and pollutants, were on the faculty here for many years, he till 1994, and Grace still is going strong. I saw a video of her out actually doing sediment samples from 2017. I thought that, I'm not sure I would be out in the field in those conditions, but she's studied the Chesapeake Bay, its history, ecology, paleobiology, taken these core samples to see what was it like 14,000 years ago. She became a full professor in 1990, one of very few in the engineering faculty. And in fact, I looked up today's statistics to see how many of the professoriate in engineering are women. And depending on if you count tenure and tenure track, it's still 20%, which is not where we want to be, but that's where we are. Next is Dean Beverly Wendland, who's the Dean of the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences and has been since 2015. She came to Hopkins in the biology department in 1998, became chair of the biology department, and then became dean. She, as I mentioned, was a UCSD undergraduate, went to Stanford for her graduate work in neuroscience, did a postdoc, as I recall, back at UCSD, and came out here, where she was quite successful. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and many tributes to her scientific work, mostly on, I had to look it up, but endocytosis, which she can explain, I can't, but it's basically how things move through membranes of cells, which I thought, but she's been recognized widely for that. And I was a member of the academic council when she was a young faculty member, and we had a luncheon to talk about what it takes to get tenure, and I never would have guessed at that luncheon that she'd be my boss. So that's where we are.
Me neither.
And finally, Sarah Coreas, who's an undergraduate and represents the current generation of women at Johns Hopkins. She's majoring in molecular and cellular biology and a minor in space science and engineering, which is a very unusual combination, I think. She's from Palmdale, California, and she's a first-generation student who graduated first in her class at the Palmdale Aerospace Academy, which sounds like space camp with grades, but it's really sounds like a fun place. My father, who was a space scientist and worked on food, probably would have sent me to such a place if he'd had his wish instead of wasting my time on history. Sarah says that she has had Hopkins as a dream school since she was 11 years old. And I believe that, but then I also believe that she obviously never read that list of least fun colleges, or if she did, she ignored it because, of course, we were just ahead of the University of Chicago and just behind the Naval Academy, but that's all right. She was a student in one of my classes last year, and Kurt Johnson, who's in the back, actually was a guest speaker in that class on campus life. And what I loved about it, he brought his transcript and he put it up on the blackboard for the students to see, and they gasped. And they, C in this and a B in this? How is it possible? Whatever happened to you, poor fellow? He went to Yale, of course, got his PhD, is in medical school at George Washington, but it was an interesting reminder of what Hopkins had been, how tough it was. Sarah was an outstanding student in that class and did this poster, which last year at this event won in a landslide vote among the alumni as the best poster done. And HerStory is her title, and that's really what inspired this panel. So without any more on my part, let me turn to Mindy and to Grace, Beverly, and to Sarah to share some of their experiences about being faculty, students, and at Hopkins. Yeah.
So Sarah said that she heard about Hopkins, maybe not as a fun place, when she was 11. I heard about Hopkins when I was 9. My brother came in as a freshman when he was 15 years old, and it was the first and only university I'd ever heard of. I was crying. I was very sad that he went away from home. We grew up on Long Island. And when I was 14, he graduated, and the library had just opened, so you could see history is very small because that was a new building at the time. And the president of the university was Milton Eisenhower, who of course was brother of Ike Eisenhower, the president of the United States. And it was a very searing experience, actually. He came up to my grandmother and myself. My grandmother had a third grade education, and he said, "I'm so honored that you're part of the Hopkins family." So I took that literally to mean that if I was part of the family, I could attend here. So he asked me where I wanted to go to school, and I said I wanted to go to school here. And the thing he said that would stop me was that it was an all-male school. And my grandmother said, "Don't worry, she's very smart. She'll do as well as her brother. You should admit women." So maybe it was my grandmother who started the whole movement here. I don't know. She was a very outspoken woman. So true to her word, when I was 16, we got word that Johns Hopkins was going co-ed. And I applied actually at the end of my junior year and got in. But then, true to Hopkins form, they said, "Go away for a year, we're not ready for you." So I thought they meant not ready for me, and I couldn't understand it, but it was a very screwball situation in that I had to find a school that would accept me for a year, knowing that I was going to leave. My parents, interestingly, did not want me to come here. They thought going to a school that was first going co-ed was just too tumultuous and disorganized, and they might have been right. But I went to a women's, actually there were two women's schools that accepted me, Radcliffe and Mount Holyoke, and I never changed my mind about coming here. So I got a call. There was one admissions officer at the time, just one for the entire undergraduate body, and he called me, because there was no email or texting, and he said, "We've decided to admit you." And again, I thought that was very personalized. So he said, "But you have to decide right away." So I was up in Massachusetts, and I took that literally, and I've told people this story. I didn't know what to do immediately. I didn't have a car. So I went to the corner of the building, the main campus building, and I just put my thumb up to hitchhike to Baltimore. And I always like to tell the story, and this is true. This is true. A guy picked me up. I thought he was very middle-aged. He might have been 30. And he picked me up, and he said, and this is true, "I'm just going out to get milk for my wife, but I'll take you." "Where are you going?" And I said, "Baltimore." And he said, "Why are you going there?" And I said, "To be in the first class of women at Johns Hopkins." And he said, "That sounds great. I'll take you there." And he took me there. Don't forget, there were no cell phones, and I always wondered to this day, what happened to him, what happened to his wife, what happened to their marriage? Because I think it took him 10 hours to go back home and get that milk. So I've always sort of wondered about it, and people have said to me, "Do you think, he was putting on the moves, the Me Too movement?" And honestly, I think it was the opposite. I think he was protecting me from that kind of thing. And I will say, going back, I stuck my thumb out again to go back, and I had 4 truck drivers take me back to Massachusetts. I just have to say, 3 years ago, I went to a scholarship luncheon here. I had founded a scholarship in the name of my mom, who was still alive. I felt it was important to do when somebody was alive, not necessarily dead. And I told the story to some students at my table, and my mother swiveled around and said, "Oh my God, that you did that? You hitchhiked?" I said, "Too late now." So I got here, and when I took my interview, the admissions officer said, "We have 50 beds to fill." That was how he came to talk about women coming here. And I reported that to my mother, who said to my father, "I don't like the sound of this." And I then came for the interview after he said, "Hurry up." And I came in, and that was the start of my career here. So I came into Hopkins. Some people like Brenda, who's here, and Linda, who's here, my dear friends from my class, started as freshmen. The bulk of us came in sophomore year. And that was because they first were starting to renovate the dorms. But true to Hopkins form, I didn't go into a dorm. They had no idea who I was, even though they had interviewed me. So they put me with 2 graduate students in Woolman Hall, which was then all graduate students. And the 2 women who were majors in astronomy did not like that I was there. And I don't blame them when I look back. I had friends, I had men coming in and out, I had women coming in and out, a lot of disorganization, a lot of TV watching, a lot of loud music. And they asked, we had a dean of women named Dottie LeBeau, They told her that they didn't want me there anymore. So the university found an apartment. Woman Hall was still an apartment building. They found me an apartment that had a full kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, dining room, and living room. So all of, I don't think, Brenda, you know this, but all of the girls in our class started coming and sleeping in my apartment. It was so luxurious. And the next year, Woman Hall became an undergraduate building, and those two girls, who I thought were the meanest people in the world, were kicked out, and I went back into the apartment and stayed there for my last few years. It was apparent, however, that Hopkins was really not ready for us. There were no, so the girls who were in the dorms had men's bathrooms. So we didn't know what to do with these urinals. We didn't even know what the name of them really was. So we had flower pots in them, we had posters, we had candles, we had all kinds of pretty things. And there were very few bathrooms on campus for women. Some buildings didn't have bathrooms at all, and some they had quickly renovated, but they didn't think about details like we all like to comb our hair. So the mirrors were all 6 feet high or taller. So if you want to comb your hair, does anyone remember? We used to jump, like you jump up, comb your hair, jump up and comb your hair. And I know a lot of women now take it for granted that it's a co-ed place, but we couldn't even use the athletic center without a male student admitting us. It's hard to believe that, but it's true. And so men would admit us, and we had a special area for lockers, and we were told not to wear two-piece bathing suits in the pool. Like they had like a fashion, like a dress code for women. And limited hours to use the gym, and limited hours to use the pool. The men didn't wear bathing suits. We wore bathing suits. The men didn't wear bathing suits, so we couldn't see them. So we had limited hours, but we had our own. That's right. We had our own swimming hours. And then they decided women should have like a sport or two. So the sport that they came up with was cheerleading. We were going to be the cheerleaders for the lacrosse team. I think no one will admit to that. No one will admit to having been a cheerleader. Brenda, you were a cheerleader? Who was a cheerleader? Oh, Cynthia. Well, she's very quiet about it. She doesn't talk about it. All right. I'm going to out her on this. Okay. I didn't think any of us really became cheerleaders. Although, you know, I was a cheerleader in high school, but by college it was not a cool thing to do. So there was that going on, and there was no doctor to serve us if we had a problem, whether it was a woman's issue or a stomach ache. They sent us on a shuttle bus to the Johns Hopkins Medical Center, and then you would sit there for hours. And there was no, of course, women really, other than a few professors who reflected ourselves. And so what we finally did, and I was 18 years old, and I look back on it now, and I'm in sort of awe of all this energy. We decided to organize a women's center. And Steve Muller, the president of the university, who had just come in, said that he would host it, and we had it in the Sherwood room. And then so many people came, we moved it here. So I find this very interesting that we're having this meeting here. And the room was overflowing with graduate students and undergraduates. And we then wrote a manifesto, because everything was radical then. And the manifesto was asking for a woman to be a woman in American Studies, Women's Studies. And we asked for a doctor on campus. We asked for sports. We asked not to be signed in to the athletic center. And I also will tell you that the Hopkins Club, where I had lunch today, did not admit women. So there are all kinds of things that we fought for. And I will say, in those years, I don't know if there's a generation of women really like this again. And I say this with a daughter who went to Johns Hopkins. We really galvanized, and what was really interesting was our class of women had a reunion in 2012, and out of the 50 women who graduated, 45 were still alive. 5 had been taken by cancer and embolisms, but 45 of us were there in 2012, and out of the 45, 42 came. And I think you cut a trip to Italy short, and Barbara Benton Hill cut a trip to China short, and there was a tremendous urge, I think all of us who didn't know each other in those years, because they never had us come together. They never had one function in all 4 years, except the Women's Center, where we could all collectively meet. So the first time that 42 out of 50, with only 3 not there who were alive, ever got together in our history was in 2012. And that was an interesting thing, and I think we all felt it was a heartfelt feeling. People came in from California, and really I think almost every state. to figure out who we all were. But what we did realize was that it was the most incredibly accomplished group of women I've ever seen. It's true that Gail, who's CEO of the American Red Cross, was in our class, but a little known fact is a woman I'm having dinner with tonight who is in our class, Barbara Benton Hill, was asked to be CEO of the American Red Cross before Gail became CEO of the American Red Cross and turned it down. Wow. I think that's a little known fact. Barbara is modest and keeps that very quiet, but I've now spilled the beans. And it was a class that, when we polled everybody, was so accomplished, it almost was statistically improbable. But the year we graduated, Steve Bullard did say that we really had caused a lot of uproar, but he also gave us money for a festival called the Festival of Women, the First Step. And we had Jane Fonda, and we had Anais Nin, and we had Anne Sexton, who had just won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. And we had a number of speakers. And when we graduated, I don't know if anyone remembers this, we not only gave a speech as women at the graduation, but Steve Muller said we were the Renaissance women. We were a class of women that not only had achieved mightily, but had done it, and I've never forgetting the important social issues of the world. And he said, you really integrated it so seamlessly, I'll never forget you all. When we graduated, a lot of professors thought that the school was going to go downhill academically, and that, of course, did not come to be because the same percentage of women graduated Phi Beta Kappa as the males. And I'm not going to say too much, but I will tell you that I did graduate at the top of my class, and we did this to, I think, break all the stereotypes that, you know, women here could not succeed. So I will then pass on the torch here to someone who really broke a barrier. But it was a time and it was a place, and I will say that I thought so highly of it despite all my radical mongering around here that I sent my daughter here. So I think that tells a lot.
Well, welcome here. So I have a completely different story. I graduated from Radcliffe, which was Harvard, which was Radcliffe at the time. And I was in the biology department there, and this was I graduated from there in 1956. So there were quite a number of women in the biology department there. It was as graduate students. It was a pretty large department, but I also was doing some work in the geology department, and there were no women students in that department. So what happens, you know, we got our PhDs there. So what happened to most women who did graduate work, finished, some maybe didn't finish? Most of us married fellow students. And then what happened to most people, women, was they became research assistants for their husbands. And so they were unpaid research assistants, and this was a big benefit for these men, obviously. But that happened to most women who were in graduate school or had finished at that time. So what happened to me was I finished work. I had worked under Elsa Barkhorn, who was a very famous biologist who had discovered the first living organisms on Earth, the oldest ones. And I thought, everything's going to be wonderful. So my husband was not in the same field I was in. And so we were going to go wherever he could get a position. And it turned out that the places that wanted him were not very interested in me. So one of these, which was a shock to me, why wouldn't everybody want me?
Touché.
So what happened then was, I'll tell a few instances. We first went to the University of Iowa, and that was pretty good. And then eventually Lucian was invited to be on the faculty at Princeton. And so we got there, and I thought, I was never so shocked, I think, in my life. Now, I had gone to Radcliffe, but it was really Radcliffe-Harvard. The classes were the same. We took the exams separately because we were honorable people, but it was quite different. When I got to Princeton, this was in 1960, 61, it was totally women. Men, sorry. There were no women there whatsoever. The only women would be secretaries in the departments. So this was shocking. I have to say that I grew up in an area where that kind of segregation didn't occur, and so it was surprising. So anyway, the interesting thing was that they did give me space to do work, and I needed a laboratory for the kind of work I was doing, as well as an office or something, and they gave me that space, and that was fine. But you need equipment and so on, and so in order to do that, I was applying for National Science Foundation grants. So I got this one proposal ready, and it had to be signed off by the chair of the department, who said, "Why are you asking for money for yourself in this? You're married, aren't you?" And I sort of tried to tell him, well, I did need it for childcare or something, or I don't know. But he approved that. He let it go. He wasn't being vindictive. It was just the way things were at that time. And I got the grant, and as it turned out, I did some advising of students there and so on. And then we moved to Hopkins in 1969. And again, Lucian was invited here to be a professor in what was Department of Geography and Environmental Engineering. And I came along, and again, I got space and some laboratory space, but again, I had to get, if I were going to do any research, I had to get equipment and so on. But the second year I was here, prior to my coming here, there was a professor of plant geography here, and he had died, and that was a pretty large part of the geography department. So the students who were here at that time asked if I could not teach plant geography, because I was trained in botany actually, and they agreed this was fine. And so I taught that course every year until last year, and I was not paid for teaching that or for advising any students until 1990, when I got tenure as at the age of 59. And so what was happening during that time, it was strange. I did get some large grants. One was to do the vegetation of Maryland, and then a lot of work on the Chesapeake Bay. And I had to get graduate students to work on these grants. First of all, I was not allowed to be the PI on these grants because I didn't have the proper, I wasn't a professor.
Like
I was
the
a
title
research
wasn't,
title,
yeah.
right. And so someone else had to be the PI on it, but then that got changed a little bit later. So, but I had to raise money for these students completely from these grants. And so I was getting very little money from those, as far as enough for childcare pretty much. But then what was happening was we were getting these papers published in very good journals and so on, and the students were getting tenure track offers from very good universities like Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara, Davis, University of Maryland, Duke, and these were for tenure track positions. And here I wasn't even a professor. I was some title they gave me so I could get research grants, and was not getting paid for getting these students. But that was sort of I often thought, well, at least I had an entry into it. They gave me space and a place to work, and I could get some money to do that work. So then I thought, when I saw these students getting these good jobs, that maybe I'd better do something about this. And it was a long haul. I tried, initially I thought, well, what I'll do is apply for jobs at other places. But what's very difficult is if you're in your late 50s applying for faculty positions someplace else, they're not too interested, even though our publications were in really good journals, and I had that record. So anyway, that was, that changed then. I was so surprised when I got my appointment as a full professor that I had I was making about 5 times as much as what I was getting on these research grants, which was not that much. So life changed a lot after that. And I've had, but at that time, I was the only tenured professor in the engineering school. I might have been the only tenured woman professor in the engineering school, but I don't think there were any other women at any rank in 1990 when I got tenure there. Now there are a few more now, but I think, Bill, you said they're not.
20%.
Yeah, so it's still pretty low. So that's, the history. So the other thing I wanted to say was I looked up some information about people who were, what was going on in terms of women in society and so on. And I vaguely remembered that when Kennedy was president, there was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. And I looked this up today. His name was John Gardner. And this was in '68. He had proposed that the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and actually they did establish an agency in Washington that would hire people part-time, 20 hours a week, something like that. So the purpose of this was to provide an opportunity for women to get jobs so they could work part-time. This would alleviate a lot of the problem of trying to work full-time with children and so on. But it was amazing that this person at that time was very interested in his philosophy, or what he talked about was one of the greatest wastes in the country was the fact that so many women were really highly educated in the U.S. and they were not doing anything afterwards in terms of their profession. And he felt that if universities and industry and so on would just provide part-time work, that would help a lot. And it would, but it never got anywhere. Mm-hmm. And then the other person who was pushing very much for women was Mary Bunting, who became president of Radcliffe in 1960. And she was very looking to the future very much, saying we need to hire couples because people go to school together, they get married and so on, and they need jobs at the same place. That didn't go anywhere anyway for a long time. And so I think the thing that a lot of changes have happened, and a lot of change, and the experience that Mandy talked about was very important. And why it all happened, I'm not sure. It happened at Princeton at the same time. They became co-educational at the same time we came here. But it seems to me, thinking back and thinking ahead, one thing has not changed, and that's the child care problem, because it was always a problem for me just finding someone to take care of your children. And so Hopkins now has a very nice, beautiful pre-kindergarten place where you can have your children. It costs a fortune. It's well over $20,000 a year per child. People have their children when they're young, and that's when they need that, and that's very, very expensive. It would be a good thing, but it's the cost. So you're still forced to try to find some kind of child care. And I think, and there may be some data about this, but the attrition rate of women in academia is high. They are hired, they don't get promoted to tenure, or they leave. And I think a lot of it is due to the fact that we're not facing the child care for women. It's a very important thing. So anyway, that's a few of the things that I thought I'd bring to your attention, talk to you about.
Well, I think the two of you have teed up some good comments that I can reflect on. So first of all, to the best of my knowledge, having been hired in our biology department in 1998, I think I'm the 4th woman to be hired in that department, and all 4 of us are still here. And the first woman to be hired in biology is Dr. Ruchi Wong, and she tells stories. Bill, you were making me think of this, and I think maybe Mindy. When she was on the faculty, they would have there would be these faculty gatherings in the Hopkins Club, and she would have to sneak in a back door to get in there. So and also she was expected to serve the tea. So let me just say things have changed a lot in that regard. Thank goodness. Things have changed a lot. Now in our department, we have an additional 6 female faculty. So now there are 10. There will be 10 effective July 1st, because we've just hired another junior faculty member who will be joining us this summer. We're very excited about her. 2 of our female faculty members are actually Bloomberg Distinguished Professors that we share with the School of Medicine, one of whom has a Nobel Prize. So that's pretty slick. We're happy about that. So as the dean, obviously addressing many of these issues about the equity and the opportunities for women professionally, and through the whole pipeline, supporting our undergraduates, our graduate students, and so forth, addressing this leaky pipeline issue that Dr. Brush alluded to. These are all things that are really on my plate, and actually on all of our plates. As far as getting people in the door, we are working very hard on, for example, with our graduate students, we have really enhanced the benefits to our graduate students. And now this is a situation where, from my point of view, I try to think of it as not a women's issue, but a parent's issue when it comes to the child care. Because we really want to try to encourage the dads or the co-parents, whatever the situation may be for the family. Both people should be participating and contributing to the care of the children, and it shouldn't be the woman's responsibility. And in fact, I believe that the child care center on our campus happened once the dads got involved and were insisting that we needed to have a child care center. That's at least my anecdotal observation. Would you agree with that, Bill?
As one of the dads who never got any help back in the 80s.
Yeah, so I did see that it was when it became a parent's issue and not a mother's issue that situation got resolved. So in many respects, that's incredibly infuriating that it should require that. On the other hand, I think it's also an indication of some of the changes within our culture where, when we have parental leave, what happens in some places is the woman who has had to give birth uses the parental leave to have physical recovery from what she has just been through. The dads take parental leave, and then they just get more research time. And so then that, again, then provides them with further advancement to their career, just like their unpaid wives that with great credentials working in their labs for free for them, as used to happen, but not anymore. So, there are all of these inequities, and we are doing our very best to try to address them so that there is as much equality with respect to the benefits and the expectations all around. And we are hoping that some of these issues will help address some of these leaky pipeline factors. Another thing that we have done is for our tenure clock, we used to have a situation where the tenure clock could be delayed by 1 year if you had a child, but you could only delay it for 1 year and no more, even if you had more than one child. And so that has now changed so that if you have multiple birth events, you can stop the clock multiple times. And we also changed it so that the policy is now automatic. So you don't have to request your tenure clock be advanced, but rather it's assumed that will be the case. If you want to go up early, fine, you have that option, but we assume that will be the case, so that there isn't any sort of stigma associated with having to ask for that. So these are just some of the cultural kind of changes we're trying to introduce that will, we hope, contribute in some ways to plugging up that leaky pipeline. I also want to call to your attention this report that was just recently published on the Provost's website. It's the JCHU report on faculty composition. And Fenimore Fisher is in the back here. He is our Chief Diversity Officer and the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion. He is the author of this report, and I encourage you all to look at it. It goes through department by department across the entire university, the faculty demographics, broken down by department, by gender, by race and ethnicity, and all of these different factors. This is our second such report. The first one came out 2 years ago, and so now that we have our second report, we can start looking at some of the trends and places where we have made some improvements. I can tell you from this report that in the fall of 2015, when the first report's data was collected, we had 42% women faculty across the university. And then this report is based on the faculty data from the fall of 2017, and we increased by 2%, so we now have 44% women faculty across the whole university. And the thing that's really encouraging is not only are these trends on the upswing, but we also, in this most recent report, did a peer comparison. And that's one of those things that's like, you know, do you want to ask the question before you know the answer, right? And in this case, the answer was one that we can feel quite proud of. So we are tied with Columbia University to be first place in this list of our Ivy Plus peers in terms of the percent of women on our faculty. And so they also have 44% women. In third place tied are, let's see, third place tied, I'm not finding it right here. Anyway, so there are a couple of other universities that were tied for third place with like 41%. And it goes all the way down to the bottom. The people who are at the bottom are Harvard with 29% and then MIT with 28%. So I think that we stand in very good stead on that. And but of course those are not laurels we want to rest on. We continue to want to do our very best, because we want to make sure that we have the very best faculty we can get here. And so it's not really like we want to hire more and more women. We want to hire the very best faculty we can hire. And it so happens that a whole bunch of them happen to be women. So, you know, it all works out. This has happened because at least in our school, we've made some really strong strides to improve our hiring practices so that we're able to ensure that we are addressing issues of diversity and inclusion as we go through our hiring processes. And this has made a really big difference. And that's what I attribute our own school's contributions to our gains in female faculty across the university. And we've done a number of other initiatives that help us improve the situation for women. I was actually a member of the inaugural committee on the status of women in the Krieger School that was developed after the Vision 2020 report that was published in 2006. And that was a study that was done to assess the conditions of being a woman faculty at Hopkins. And so that committee continues to do a lot of great work. One of the things that they've done recently that I think is really terrific is spearheaded an effort to apply for something called an NSF Advance Grant, which helps us to identify practices that will encourage and support the careers of women faculty in STEM fields. And so we applied for this grant. We didn't get it the first time. We're preparing to resubmit it, but there were some really good ideas that we had in that grant, and so even before we learned that it wasn't funded, we thought we need to do some of these things already. And so one of the things that we did was something called launch committees for new female faculty that were starting in some of our STEM departments. And these are this very deliberate mentoring kind of process for these faculty that really helps get their careers launched on a really steep trajectory right out of the gates. These have been incredibly popular, very successful, and we have been branching out to offer these launch committees to other faculty in other departments. And that also brings me to another thing that we've been working very hard on, which is mentoring of our faculty. And I was talking to some colleagues earlier this morning, remembering when I was a junior faculty and I was at a luncheon event, and one of our senior faculty in our department said something that struck me as odd. And I really honestly cannot remember exactly what the statement was, but it caused me enough concern about his perception of me as a faculty member and my belongingness as a faculty member that it caused me concern. And so I went to one of the 3 senior faculty women in the department to ask her opinion on this conversation that I had been a part of and what I should do. And she suggested I go talk to the department chair, and I did. And then he said, oh, he's like that with everybody. He didn't say that because you're a woman. And so, so that was fine. I mean, so I didn't try to, I don't go around looking for things like chip on my shoulder or whatever. And so it really was something that must have been quite strong for me to feel concerned about it. But anyway, my reaction to that was, well, if he's like that with everybody, then I'll just give it right back to him. And so I did, and then we became fast friends, and it was fine. But in talking to my colleagues about this morning, it made me realize, like, why did I go to a woman faculty instead of just straight to my department chair? And I think that that really tells the story of why this is also important, you know? I felt like I needed to go and talk to a senior woman faculty to have that opportunity to divulge my concerns and to feel like I was going to be heard. And I think that that is why representation is so important. And being the first is so hard. So thank you to all of our women undergraduates who were the brave ones to be the first ones. In a time when there was like almost no representation, right? And so we need to have those brave people who are strong enough to be those firsts, and then to just, you know, help just smooth the way more and more for everyone that comes later. And so that's really one of the things that I have been working very hard on as dean, and will continue to do so.
Hello all, I'm very excited to be here today, and I'm even more excited that no one will be grading me today. I guess I'll talk a little bit about this here poster. When Professor Leslie asked me to participate in this panel a while ago, the first thing I did, like any Hopkins student, was to study. So I dug up all of my notes, because of course not everything I compiled made it onto the poster. Mind you, this is a very, very long document, because this kind of turned into more of a passion project and less of an assignment. So I had a project partner, and we went through yearbooks, and we went through photographs, and we went through just so many primary sources. But by far my favorite were the oral histories, the interviews, because I just really think the best way to understand a time and place that you didn't live is to listen to someone else who has lived it. So a couple weeks ago, I'm going through these, and I come across this interview. And the name on the top is Mindy Farber. And I'm like, gosh darn it, why is that so familiar? Why is that so familiar? And then it clicks. And I couldn't imagine that, like a year from then, not only would I get to meet you, but to sit here and to speak with you, which is an incredible honor. Right.
So
Oh, I'm sorry.
that's okay.
Sure, thank you.
We just have people online too, so I want to make
Oh.
sure everybody can hear.
Right. So, one of the, how can I word this? Excuse me. Reading her experience showed me that mine was so starkly different, and I'm gladly so. I think, well, I can only speak from my own experience and my own perspective. I can never experience Hopkins as like a transgender woman or a black woman, but amongst my peers, I feel like there's this general consensus that we're really accepted, that our professors don't talk down to us, that our peers, men and women alike, are viewed as very equal just because of the academic rigor of this school and how difficult it is to be accepted and how difficult it is to like continue existing here and to make it through all of the coursework. So yes, of course incidences still pop up, like the concerning one that you mentioned, but they're very isolated, and when I speak about them to other friends, it's like they're shocked. Things that would have been the norm a couple decades ago are like audacious, they're shocking. Excuse me. But when I was reading through your experiences, Mindy, I realized we did have a lot of parallels. So as Professor Leslie mentioned, I wanted to come to Hopkins when I was 11 years old, and that's a very fun story. I was sitting in my 5th grade classroom, and a little boy walks in wearing a Hopkins lacrosse hoodie, right? Now, I'm from California, and of course Hopkins prestige is all over, but it's a little less known in California, unless you're some sort of academic or you like science and you read a lot of papers. But my teacher was very excited. She goes, "Hopkins, who goes to Hopkins?" And this little boy explains that his older sister goes to Hopkins, and he's like beaming with pride. And me, being 11 years old and loving science and education and everything, I'm like, what is Hopkins? Do I need to be there? I think I need to be there. And a very common assignment you'll get in school is like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Where do you want to go to college? And it was always in the back of my mind. I'm like, let's look up that Hopkins place again. And every year I would come back to it, I would look at it, I would read about the research that they do here, and I would read about just being on the cutting edge of just any passion you could possibly have. And it was inspiring, especially very young. I wanted to be a doctor, so I'm like, well, I have to go to Hopkins. It's morphed a little bit. I'd like to go into research now, but I still very much enjoy Hopkins. So yeah, it was just such a good fit, and over the years I worked very hard, and I'm really happy to be here today and to hopefully do a good job representing the other women that have come before me, that have cleared a path, that have made it so that my existing here is the norm and not something novel and like odd. So I have a 9-year-old brother. He turns 9 today, so a very happy birthday to my little Joey. But you best believe we bought him a hoodie, and he wears it to class, and I'm hoping I'm paying it forward in some way. So yeah, I'm really excited to hear your questions, so I want to make sure I don't take up too much time. I'll let us get to that, but thank you very much.
If I could also just add quickly that this current class of freshmen is a pretty significant majority women students. And in fact, the engineering dean has been working really, really hard to increase the representation of women in the engineering majors. And last year, or this current class of freshmen, he finally achieved his initial goal of getting over 40% women in the engineering majors, and nationally it's 20%. And his goal is to get to parity, so he's not stopping there. Anyway, just to point that out.
I must say, I can't imagine 4 women that I'd rather sit behind than this panel. I'm very proud to be colleagues with and instructors with them. And I will say that Dean Wendland really has pushed very successfully on this agenda. But we'd really like to hear from your recollections or your questions or your comments to the panel or just to the world. And I think, Allison, do you have a mic, or do I have a? Okay, we have a mic. So if you put your hand up, we'll get a question. And I think Dean Wendland has to leave a little after 6, but so if she runs off, it's not for lack of interest.
Can I just mention one thing?
Sure, Mindy.
There's something that I forgot, and I just want to mention, and I think it'll resonate here because I'm listening to all the achievements, and I'm just so impressed by you. But I do have to say, if anyone recalls this phenomenon, when we came here as undergrads and we went into a room, and I've told this story over and over again, and Teresa and I just talked about this, we'd walk into any room, any class, any building, we could be wearing the shortest shorts or the longest dresses, we could be any which way, and no matter where we were, we'd sit and the men would all move back. Then, if more women came in, the men continued to move back. And I thought maybe I was imagining this, but Teresa affirmed this today. I think Brenda does, and I think Linda did. And if anyone, in the question and answer has any resolution to why this happened, after 40-something years, I'd like to know. But I will say there was a class in Gilman that was oversubscribed, and so there were too many people in the class, and Gilman always had the little rooms. And so the men kept moving back, and finally they hit the wall. And I thought that was very symbolic. But they couldn't go any further, so at that point, like toy soldiers, they just started marching out the door. So if any guy here today was in my class, I want to know why that was.
So please, the floor is open.
I was a male student at that time. I think the men were probably terrified. That's probably the answer to that. Actually, just to show what you were facing, I recall. I think it was probably the year before we went co-ed, and I was doing a story for the newsletter and interviewing Wilson Schaffer, there's a building named after, and he said it would be the stupidest thing in the world to admit women because all they do is get married and get pregnant, and that their education is wasted, and that literally was the attitude of a lot of people here, and I think, that shouldn't be forgotten that it was. This is someone a building is named after, and so the barriers weren't imagined; they were genuine and real. And at that time, of course, Hopkins was in a wave of places going co-ed in those years. But the other thing, Bill, is I thought you should give specific credit to Mary Elizabeth Garrett, not just to the Women's Committee, because I think she really deserves it for what happened down at the med school.
She does. Without her, not only would we not have the medical school, we wouldn't have the 4 doctors, which are in the famous painting by John Singer Sargent, which she commissioned and paid for.
Michael, I just want to say that I'll never forget the name Michael Hill because I thought you were the greatest. You were not only the best student, you were editor of the student newspaper when I came in, but I thought you were also the coolest guy. Just had to tell you that.
I can't hear you.
Hello.
Yep,
Can
we
you hear
got
me?
you.
Yeah, my name is Kurt Johnson. I'm a graduate of the class of 1965. I have a couple comments. Hopkins has been known for decades as a nerd school, and
Still is.
I was like the biggest nerd at this school when I came here. And one of the comments I want to make is that the addition of women to Johns Hopkins made this such a better school. The women who come here are not nerds, but the men who come here are probably still nerds. The second comment I wanted to make is about, I'm a professor at GW Medical School and on the admissions committee there. Our medical school is more than 60% women. And the last interview I did this year for admission to our medical school was from a Johns Hopkins senior who was a biomedical engineering student. GW admits more than admits the best students we can find, and it just turns out these days that the women applicants are better than the men applicants, so we admit women. Our class is now more than half, I think it's 60-40 women to men. This is not a reflection of anything that GW is doing consciously. It's just that the applicant pool of women is now better than the applicant pool of men. And it's partly because a lot of the young men in America are struggling in one way or another, but the women seem to have their act together. So when I interview an applicant to medical school who's a man, a woman, gay, transgender, whatever, I'm looking at whether or not that person has their act together and really understands what it means to go to medical school. And I find that most of the applicants who are women have their act together more than most of the men, so we admit them. Anyway, I'm also incredibly proud of being a graduate of this school. It was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me in my life that I got in here. And it set up my whole life. But the other thing I wanted to say is that the world since 1961, when I started here, has changed so dramatically. It's really quite incredible. And now I think women have really good access to the professions, and not only in medical school, but in the sciences and so forth. I'm a minority in my department now. There are more women in my department than there are men. My chairman is a woman, and she became the chairman because she's the best person in the department. So for the young women who are out here in the audience, what I want to say to you is that work hard and do well, and we'll look at you as an individual, not as a woman or as a man, but as a person, and we'll try to evaluate you based on your accomplishments rather than your gender.
Thank you. How come all the men are asking the questions here? There's something wrong. Next up, back there. Oh, Francis, you have the floor, but it seemed odd to me that all the questions.
So as another male Hopkins graduate, class of '94, I'm Francis Park. Very briefly, I just remember being a history major, foolishly enough taking a course in computer science for distribution, and I remember being vaguely envious of the women students who were there, who were more than holding their own, and I was just hanging on for dear life. But more briefly, and this is really a question for the panel writ large, what were some of the, I guess, watershed moments that you might have seen in your own experiences in terms of, leveling the playing field? Or at least making progress towards that end.
Go ahead, sure.
So the question was, what was a watershed moment in life or at Hopkins? Or in Hopkins' life? You mean here at Hopkins?
Yes, at least in your own experience.
At Hopkins.
Watershed moments that you might remember that particularly stick out.
Here, well, for me, we had in those days advisors. I don't know if the undergraduates still do, but we were assigned to advisors, and my advisor was a guy named Fred Dearman, and he would take me out for milkshakes, because I like them, at Blackstone Pharmacy, which was next door to where I lived. And I was going to go to grad school, and he said, there's something that you might do instead. Grad school is getting to be a really tricky place. I had gotten into a very good grad school, but he said, it's getting kind of saturated, and you might think about going to law school. And then he said, there's a scholarship I heard about called the Ruth Tilden Scholarship for Women at NYU Law School, and you get in based on grades and extracurricular stuff, and you probably could qualify. So I wrote, because everything was writing then, to the Ruth Tilden Scholarship for Women at NYU Law School, and it turned out to be the Root Tilden Scholarship for undergraduate men and women, which really changed the game a bit. And they did 20 in each they did 20 totally in the country, 2 for each judicial circuit. So 20 people won it. Well, Hopkins was so behind me on this that they did 2 things. They paid for my airfare to interview in Richmond, because I had a better chance interviewing from the 4th Circuit where I went to school than the 2nd Circuit where I was from. And I then went to Steve Muller, and I said, my brother, who went to Hopkins, is in New York visiting this weekend. I don't know what to do. And he said, go interview, and we'll fly you back to New York, and then we'll fly you back to Baltimore, and the school paid for the whole thing. And the other thing that Steve Muller arranged for was he had a professor here, David Harvey, who I just asked you about, who was I'd taken a class in Marxism from him, and Steve Muller said to him, write an evaluation for her that will make it easier for women to get into law school. So I had a big crush on him. I just have to tell you that. I thought he was like the handsomest person in the world. And he wrote, she is crisp and efficient, not warm and effusive, which I really was sad by that. I thought he was a very warm and effusive person. But he said Steve Muller told him to write crisp and efficient so that as a woman I would get into a good law school and get the Ruth Tilden Scholarship, which I did. So Hopkins really pushed me, and as a result, I got into a very good law school, and things went from there.
Fantastic. We had, who's up next? There we are.
I want to thank all of you for being role models, for being mentors. I think probably the hardest part of going through undergraduate, being first generation, was not having that mentorship and that guidance. I'm class of 1994, and to this day, I will not forget going to my academic advisor and being told, instead of going to medical school, I should set my sights on nursing school. And that was here 25 years ago. I'm a doctor. I did what I wanted to do,
Huzzah.
in spite of him. But it shows that we still have glass ceilings to break. We cannot rest where we are. And we as women have to be more proactive in being mentors in guiding the future generation to get where we need to be.
100%.
We had one back here, and then I know people
I'm
are going to.
good till 6:20.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
we'll take a couple more, but the bar is only open till 6:30.
Oh, well.
I'll take only one more question.
Even the dean can't stand between us and the bar.
That's right.
Hi, my name is Kate, class of 2014. My question kind of goes off of the last question, actually, in terms of like reflecting on how far we've come and also how far we have to go. What are your personal reflections on how do you keep up momentum when some days it feels like we haven't made much progress at all?
Yeah.
How do you keep up the momentum and like there's no progress at all?
Can I take this?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Hi.
Someone
I'll
who's
take this.
carrying the momentum. Perfect.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say, especially having studied how far we've come and how much effort and how much advocacy has gone into me being able to be here. I almost feel like it's like a duty that I really should keep going. Like, how could I let all of these brave and inspiring people invest so much into me without doing the same for the people that will follow me? Yeah.
One of the things that I found was in the early 70s, just not too long after I got here, I had a very large grant to produce a map of the forests of Maryland, which eventually was published in 1980 in Ecological Monographs. So this involved a lot of field work, and it involved having a large number of students working in the field. And I advertised for students and so on. The majority of those people were women. And that project was essentially, there were a few men in it, but it was really essentially a women's project. And one of the very interesting anecdotes that I have for that is we did a lot of work on the Eastern Shore as well as the rest of the state. And when the teams who were all women on the Eastern Shore, we had no problems with anyone because the men thought that these women were nurses from Johns Hopkins, and therefore they were very acceptable to be women working in the field. So one experience I had.
I guess I can just quickly say that, not every day is a super sunshiny day, I guess today as an example, right? And, it's hard to keep a smile pasted on your face, right? But, sometimes you need to, and you have to try to earn an Oscar award while doing it, right? But it can get tiring, and so that's what networks are for. That's what your friends are for, and you got to have at least a couple of people that you can just vent get it out of your system, and then it sounds totally cheesy, but I have really been working hard on this my own self, is challenges are opportunities, you know, and when you see those things where you're feeling like, why just isn't this working? That's an opportunity to find, something is being revealed to you that is a problem to be solved and a way to move forward, and that's information. And so it's very human nature, and I think it's unhealthy to deny that, and so you got to have those safe places to vent, like get it out of your system, and then truly try to find the positive lessons to be gained so that you can continue to move forward.
I just wanted to say that very quickly, when I was a senior here, I distinctly remember standing in front of Gilman Hall and saying, I vow never to lose my interest in social causes as I stand here now, and I just somehow, either good for good or bad, always remembered that. So I think a big thing is I've never given up on social causes and movements, and I think I drive John crazy because my latest thing is I've been taking fur coats from women all over and giving them back to the wildlife. And I just recently, we had about $500,000 worth of coats in the laundry room from women, and that's sort of funny in a way, but it really exemplifies, I think, that for me, it's always doing something. We're sponsoring a guy from Venezuela now to get him into the United States, and I'm always doing something, and people laugh at me all the time, but it's never it's sort of that Peter Pan thing, I'll never grow up, but in a good way, I think it's, and I don't like in a lot of ways what young women are doing now, as much as we get all these statistics of how everybody's gone to school and the majority here and the majority there. I look at my own daughter and her generation, and it's true that they've done a lot, but it's also true that they're not doing a lot, that they come home at the end of a day, they don't join anything, they're really sort of absorbed, and maybe in a good way in their family, but I feel like the social causes are still on our shoulders, our generation, but I keep going with it, and I keep hoping that the women after us will take up the cause and not forget that there's a world out there, there's a country, Venezuela, that now has no water, but just keep going and never to lose the desire to help other people.
I think that's a pretty good place for us to thank our panel. What? All right, I'll give one.
So my name is Rohit, class of 2017. So one of the things I was aware of as an undergraduate, and for the past 2 years from my colleagues and classmates who are still here, was sexual assault is one of the biggest problems on campus. And as we all know, sexual assault and sexual harassment primarily affects women.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you had any insight as dean as to why the administration and President Daniels is so hell-bent, pardon my language, on pursuing a private police force when violent crime isn't one of the main issues. Sexual assault and sexual harassment is the biggest issue on campus. And instead of pursuing initiatives towards improving Title IX, the administration is pushing for this private police force despite the intense pushback from both students and faculty.
So, you know, I'm not in a position to speak for President Daniels, okay? I will say that there has been a huge investment and a lot of energy put into the Office of Institutional Equity and trying to address our capacity to respond to Title IX related issues. And so I don't agree with you necessarily that it's the case that it's one or the other. I think it can be both and in terms of addressing concerns of violence within our city and concerns about sexual violence and sexual assault on our campus.
Okay, with that, I'm going to call it to an end and thank our panelists very much for making the time. But also for setting such great examples. I'm just really proud to be in the same institution that produced 4 women like this. And I won't stand between you and the bar, but you can please talk with them afterwards. And thanks for coming. It was really a great event. I appreciate it.